I'm building this great old farmhouse from a budget wood kit, and as I do, I'm sharing some techniques about how to make a kit structure something truly unique, and I'm starting right now. Hi, I'm Ron of Ron's Trains and Things, and I'm building a farm scene on the new section of my layout that will include an old barn, a cornfield, a hayfield with some cows, and of course, an old farmhouse. And I'm building that farmhouse today. I'm using a laser cut wood kit from RSLaserKits. Now, RSLaserKits is a mom and pop laser cut wood structure company that makes structures in 7 different scales, so a wide variety and a large number of structures that they offer. And I'm going to provide a link to RSLaserKits in the description down below so you can check them out, but you can also purchase their kits at my sponsor, Midwest Model Railroad. Now, I want to say before I get started that many times I see scenes on model railroads of farms with pristine little farmhouses and beautifully painted red and white barns and great landscaping that's all cute and quaint. But I grew up on a farm and I have lived in rural areas nearly all of my life, and I know that not all farms look like that. Many of them are very humble estates with older homes, some of them with need of paint and repair. They have old rundown barns, machinery lined along fence rows and such. And that's the type of farm scene that I am modeling. So as I build this structure today, you're going to see I'm going to use just a very basic color from the painting with some peeling paint effects. It's going to be a fairly simple structure, but it's going to fit the type of farm scene that I'm trying to create. So I hope you'll keep that in mind as we go. And with that in mind, let's head over to the workbench and get started. This video is brought to you by Midwest Model Railroad. Now with 15,000 square feet and 1-day shipping, they truly are your one-stop model railroad shop. MidwestModelRR.com. Link in the description. The specific kit I'm working with today is the Roundtree Farmhouse in N-Scale from RSLaserKits. This kit is also available in a brick version. Opening up the kit, we have a set of instructions with illustrations. The instructions are reasonably detailed and easy to follow. The kit uses window and door castings from Tichy Train Group. The scale lumber bundle is for both bracing and corner trim. The subroof parts are cut from a tempered hardboard product. This kit came with wood-type shingles, and they look really good, but I wanted a more modern look for my farmhouse, so I'm saving these for another project. Finally, we see the wall sections, which are laser cut from thin wood stock. Step 1 is always to make sure that all of the parts are present. My kit was short some window castings, but I emailed Rich at RSLaserKits and he got me the missing windows immediately. I appreciate their great customer service. I started by cutting the wall sections from their carrier sheets. As an N-scaler, nearly every wood kit that I build has one part somewhere that is very fragile and determined to break. This tiny piece next to this door was the one in this kit. By the time I was finished, I had broken it 3 times and ended up replacing it, but it worked out well, and I'll show you all of that issue when I come to it. As I cut each piece from the carrier sheet, I lightly sanded the edges with a medium sanding stick to remove the bumps at the attachment points. I also cut the blanks out of the door and window openings at this time, sanding those edges lightly as well. I wanted to build a model of an old farmhouse with peeling paint and weathered wood beneath the paint, so I first stained the walls with Hunterline weathering stain, creosote black. Someone will ask why I didn't install bracing behind the walls first to avoid warping. Honestly, it's a preference, and my process eliminates warping as well. I find bracing that's installed at the beginning simply gets in the way in the early stages of the build. I brushed a generous amount of the stain over all of the wall sections. I worked on a paper towel to minimize mess. When I had stained all of the wall sections, I folded the paper towel over the top of the walls, placed a flat board over the parts, and weighed it down to prevent warping while the stain dried. This, along with bracing installed later, kept the walls nice and straight. After the walls had dried for several hours, I removed the weights and continued. One wall required some outside bracing to support part of the roof later. I thought it best to install these braces before painting, as gluing to paint doesn't produce a strong bond. I cut the braces at the appropriate angle for the roof from the largest bracing stock provided in the kit. For all glue joints on this kit except for the window glazing, I used yellow Carpenter's wood glue. I prefer it for wood-to-wood applications as it is formulated specifically for wood. Just make sure to remove any glue that will show on the finished model, as it does not dry clear. I applied the glue with the handle from a used microbrush with the head twisted off. These make great applicators for applying glue to small parts. Next, it was time to paint the walls. To produce the peeling paint effect on wood, I use a technique using Turpenoid and inexpensive craft paint. Turpenoid is an artist's thinner for oil paints and such, and I use it for numerous projects, including weathering with artist's oils and this peeling paint effect. I'll post a link to Turpenoid in my Amazon Pick of the Week in the description below this video if you'd like to check it out. You can also use mineral spirits or white spirits for this effect if you have that on hand for track cleaning and such. I work with 1 or 2 wall sections at a time here, as timing is critical. I begin by painting on a liberal application of Turpenoid. Do not let it dry, but follow it quickly with a liberal coat of paint. Again, this is one of the few times that I use craft paint on a model like this, because this technique needs a thick paint. Because the stain is so dark under the paint, I painted on 2 coats, one immediately after the other. When the wall was well covered, I let it dry just to the touch. While the first wall was drying, I applied Turpenoid and paint to the second wall. The Turpenoid slows the drying process of the paint, so just watch it and use your best judgment as to how many walls to work at a time. I went ahead and painted a third wall before continuing with that first wall. When the paint on the first wall was dry to the touch, I used strips of inexpensive clear cellophane tape to peel the paint. The amount of paint that you peel off will vary according to how hard you press the tape onto the wall and how thoroughly the paint is dried. I just touch the tape to the wall and then pull it off for a light amount of peeling. The paint still peeled a bit more than I desired, but I can touch some of the peeling effect up by lightly stippling on some more white paint after it dries. I kept repeating this process until I had painted and peeled all of the exterior walls. Sometimes the way you press the tape on or the way you peel it off produces these badly peeled lines. I really don't like them, and I don't think they look right. I went ahead and stippled some paint back onto these parts immediately. Once all of the walls had been peeled and were dry to the touch, I again sandwiched them between a couple layers of paper towel and weighed them down under a board until they were completely dry. I left them overnight. The next day, I removed the weights, and I was quite pleased with the results. At this point, I installed all of the bracing to the back of the walls per the instructions. Again, the wood needed for bracing is included in the kit. I clamped each brace in place with modified clothespin clamps. You can make these with regular sized clothespins, but in N scale and in any scale when working with small, delicate parts, I find that clamps made from miniature clothespins that are sold for hobby use work great. To modify the clothespins into clamps, I pull one side of the clothespin at a time out of the spring, turn it over and end for end, and insert it back into the spring, then repeat on the other side of the clothespin. This way the handle becomes the clamp and they are nice and straight. It's good to have a healthy number of these on hand, as I used about 30 of them at once to clamp all of the bracing on while the wood glue dried. Having pressed the walls while they dried kept them pretty straight, so once this bracing was installed, they were in really good shape with no warping. I let that glue dry for a couple of hours, then removed the clamps. At this point, I test fit the walls together just to see how they were going to fit. I wish I had worked a little harder at this test fit because I ended up having one minor misfit, which you will see in a few moments, and I could have avoided it if I had test fit these a little more carefully. Hey, let me pause for a moment to say that if you're enjoying this farmhouse build and you'd like to see more model railroad tips, tools, and techniques to help you build your dream layout, then be sure to subscribe down below and click the little bell icon so you can catch future videos. Next, I worked on the window and door castings. The kit has 20 windows and 3 doors, so this took some time. I cut the sprues apart with side cutters to avoid tension on the parts while removing them. I then cut the parts from the sprue with my flush cutting tweezers. I love this tool for neatly removing parts from sprues. And if you'd like to check one out, I'll drop a link to them in my Amazon pick of the week in the description as well. I used a small sanding stick to sand smooth all of the injection gates on each casting. Each door is 2 parts, a door frame and the door itself. I removed them from the sprue in exactly the same way. I spray painted all of these castings. I first taped them to a board with painter's tape curled backwards. Be sure to leave enough space between the parts to allow you to paint them from all directions. I also attached the sub-roof material, the floor and foundation boards for painting as well. I painted all of these with a rattle can primer. The castings I painted white, and the sub-roof and floor sections I painted gray. I didn't film the spray painting because I did it outside and it was dark, but just be sure to use light passes and to paint the parts from every angle. And here are those parts after painting. While that paint was drying, I gave some attention to the window and door openings and the edges of the walls. I drug my hobby knife blade across these edges to remove any excess paint that had built up. In the windows and doors, this paint buildup can keep the castings from fitting properly. It also allows the glue to adhere to wood and not just the paint. As on most wood kits that I have built, a wood corner brace is needed at each wall corner to fit the corners together rather than just butting the walls back to end. These corner pieces will be covered later by trim. The corner boards are included in the kit, and I carefully cut the corners on the gable walls to match the roof angle. I glued each corner brace to the end of the wall with wood glue. It's easy to overlook the short corner on the second story of the back wall, but this wall needs a corner brace as well. We are almost ready for assembly, but first, I scraped some paint off of the floor piece where the center wall would attach and around the edges of the floor for good glue adhesion. The instructions said to install the window and door castings before assembly, but in my haste to get the house assembled, I simply overlooked it. Ultimately, it didn't matter as installing them after assembly was just as easy and worked just fine. I assembled the walls generally in the order indicated by the instructions, beginning with the center wall that divides the 2 parts of the house. I applied glue to the bottom of the wall and the locating tab. I initially held this wall in place and plumb with a 1-2-3 block and a machinist square. After that glue had tacked for a few minutes, I installed the rear wall, attaching it to the floor edge and the end of the center wall that I had just installed. Once that wall was tacked in place, it was simply a matter of attaching the other walls in an order that made sense, being sure to get good glue joints and to square each corner as I went. That was where I ran into a little snag. As I was installing the last wall, I realized that the floor piece was cut slightly too narrow in one direction, which had thrown off the back wall and thus the squareness of the end wall. There wasn't much to be done at this point, as most of the glue on the walls had dried. Fortunately, the issue was minor, and for my model, I could chalk it up to it being an old house that had shifted over the years. Honestly, on the layout, I doubt anyone will ever notice. Here you see, as I mentioned earlier, that one tiny piece along the side of this door that kept breaking off. I finally gave up on saving it and installed a leftover piece of the corner bracing in its place. It fit perfectly and was completely covered by trim on the finished model. With the walls assembled, I turned to the trim. I pre-painted the trim boards. I considered a different color of paint for the trim, but again, I'm modeling a common farmhouse, so I went with white on white and used the same craft paint that I had used on the walls. I painted the trim with 2 coats. When that paint was dry to the touch, I began installing the trim. I applied wood glue to each corner brace, installed the trim piece, flushed it up along the side edge, and then cut off the excess with a sharp knife. I installed the trim so the edges of the trim on the side walls would be covered by the face of the trim on the front, giving the most finished look possible from the aisle of the layout. I cut the trim on the gable ends to match the angle of the roofline. I simply continued this process, working all the way around the house. I had to get a little ahead of myself here and install this one door on the end of the porch so I could install the trim around it. I left the trim board slightly long, knowing that I could trim and sand them later. This kit gave me plenty of lumber of each size to account for any mistakes that one might make, but unfortunately that really wasn't an issue, and I had lumber to spare when I was finished. Next, I came back to the doors and windows. I peeled them off the painter's tape. Be careful, as the doors are quite fragile. I broke one getting it off the tape. Fortunately, it was easy enough to repair. I used the point of my hobby knife to clean up bits of paint along the edges, as well as the paint that bled onto the back where I would be gluing the glazing. I installed the doors into the frames next, scraping away the paint on the edges of the doors and then inserting them into the back of the frames and gluing them in place with a couple tiny drops of solvent cement. Yes, there are some mars to the paint on some of the castings, and this would have been easy enough to touch up, but again, I'm going for a look of a house in need of a paint job, so I simply left them as they were. I then installed the window glazing. I'll be honest, with 20 windows and 3 doors, each to be painted, touched up, 2 pieces of glazing installed, and installed into the house, I spent about 4 hours just on windows and doors altogether. The glazing sheet comes with a paper protective coating on one side. After some trial and error, I found that it was easiest and safest to scratch off that paper with my fingernail before removing it from the sheet. I cut the needed pieces for one window at a time. I glued the glazing in place with canopy glue. Canopy glue is a good option for this as it dries clear and it does not cause hazing of the glass. You absolutely do not want to use CA or solvent cement for this step as it will damage the glazing. I glazed and installed the doors first and then the windows. The rear of this house shouldn't be seen on the layout, so if I had a window that I was less than happy with in appearance, I installed it on the back of the house, using the best ones on the front. By this time, all of the wood glue had completely dried, so I used a sanding stick to sand all of the corner boards and trim flush with the tops and bottoms of the walls. The outside porch floor was a separate piece. I decided to use Hunterline stain on it as well, medium brown. This very thin piece of wood was already warped, so I applied a heavy coat of stain to both sides twice to get the color that I wanted, then pressed it under a weight between paper towels as I had done with the walls. I cut the porch roof support beam. This was tricky as it's a very delicate piece and the laser had not cut as deeply into these pieces, but with care and patience I got it cut out of the carrier sheet and ready to paint. The sheet included 2 of these pieces, but you only need 1, so you have an extra if you happen to break one. I very gently sanded the edges of the part, then applied 2 coats of that same white craft paint as before. With those parts prepared, I glued the wood foundation piece onto the bottom of the house. This took some finagling due to the floor issues that I mentioned earlier, but with some care and attention, I got it in place. It includes a piece that extends into the porch area to support the porch floor. With the foundation piece in place, I glued the porch floor on. It was still slightly warped, so I clamped it down with some clothespin clamps and let the glue dry. When it was reasonably dry, I removed the clothespins and glued the support beam in place. It glues to the floor at the 3 posts as well as to the 1 exterior wall on the left side. Finally, it was time to turn to the roof. The subroof panels are perforated to allow them to bend at the peaks. For now, I did not want to glue the roof on the single-story section of the house, as I planned to add some details and lighting here, so I simply fit the roof into place. I had to notch the corners around the trim boards of the 2-story section on the left side. With the board cut to fit, I was ready to install shingles. I told you earlier that I wanted something more modern than the wood shingles that came with the kit, so I decided to use these 3-tab gray shingles from Motrac Models. They make these shingles in a variety of styles, colors, and scales. I'll provide a link to Motrac Models in the description below if you'd like to check them out. Many people suggest installing shingles with double-sided tape, and from my experience, I agree. Someone years ago recommended to me Frost King double-face tape that's designed for mounting shrink window treatment, and it works great. Once again, if you'd like to check it out, I'll drop a link to it under my Amazon Pick of the Week in the description. If you're installing small 3-tab shingles, I think you will love it. To install the shingles, you want to offset every other row by half a tab, just like real shingles. I find I get the best result if I allow the strip of shingles to overhang each end of the roof slightly, then trim them flush with a sharp hobby knife. I don't want to waste any of the shingles if possible, so when I have a strip that's less than the full length of the roof, I simply apply it as I described, then bring in a new strip, lining it up at the joint and continuing on. Honestly, with a little bit of care, I can't tell by looking where any of these joints are on the finished roof. Here you see me installing the Frost King tape, trimming it flush with the roof edge, and removing the top protective paper. Work carefully to keep your rows straight so they end straight along the ridge. If you need help here, draw some lines on the subroof before you start laying shingles, and measure every 2 or 3 rows to make sure you're staying true. When you finish one side of the roof, begin at the lower edge of the other side and just keep working your way up. These shingles do take time. In fact, the shingles and the windows together took by far the bulk of the time that I used to build this house. But the shingles look so fantastic that they are absolutely worth every minute. When I had finished all but the ridge cap of the lower roof, I test fit it back into place. For the upper roof, I glued the subroof in place before installing the shingles. I applied glue to the tops of the gable walls and held the roof in place until the glue began to tack and hold the roof. I then applied the double-sided tape and continued shingling in the same manner as I did on the first section. On a previous build, I created a ridge cap out of single tabs just like you would on a real house. You see that roof here. The problem is that these single tabs are very tiny and applying them is extremely difficult. Plus, the material is too thick to be scale, so while it looks okay, it doesn't look just quite right. Per suggestion of the kit, I decided to take a different approach to make a single ridge cap for each roof section. To do this, I cut strips from the border of the carrier sheet that the shingles came in. This strip was too wide to be right for the roof, so I used a straight edge to cut it in half lengthwise. I then folded that piece in half using the edge of the ruler as a break. I simply glued that piece onto the roof and cut it to length along the eave. The longer upper roof took 2 strips to cover, but the joint turned out so good that you can't even see it. Finally, I used some white craft paint to touch up along the trim boards and the other spots that needed it. And with that, the house was complete. Again, the lower roof is not glued in place, so I can detail and light that section. Also, I will add some porch details and other items as I install the house into the farm scene, but we will save that for another video. So to see how I build this entire farm scene and other model railroad content, check out the links on your screen. Remember my Amazon Picks of the Week, my MicroMark discount code, and the other great links I told you about in the description below. And join me on Tuesdays as I bring you even more great model railroad videos, and I'll see you on the next video. 10, Lizzie?